please follow all of our leaders. And with that, we are transitioning to our next fireside chat. Welcome, Jay McBain, Mark Stouse.
There.
A little introduction. Jay
Hello, hello.
McBain.
Jay, how are you?
I'm doing good.
Awesome.
You want me to go first?
Let's do it.
All right, Jay McBain, Chief Analyst for Canalys. Canalys is Latin for channel. We think about partnerships and alliances, ecosystems, and obviously thinking about agentic AI today as all those things surround each customer.
Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Stouse. I'm the CEO of Proof Analytics. We specialize in the other AI, causal AI. So we are all about why things happen the way they happen. If you had changed this, how would it have happened differently than it did? It's navigation, really, using AI. It's a GPS for a business.
So excited for this conversation. When we were promoting this within the community, we received a lot of questions, and obviously having you both, this fireside chat, the craziest one was, and I will start with that.
You're going to start with the craziest?
What are we going to do when the agent is going to go out of control? Jay, Mark.
Well, for me, I'm not sure it gets out of control, but the level of permutations and combinations when you're in kind of the partnering business, when you start to think about, for example, the 28 moments, measurable moments before a customer makes a decision, as traditionally marketing would have handed that off to sales. There might have been a partner at some point to collect the money. Well, today there's 28 moments where marketing and sales are both involved. There's 7 partners on average in the deal. And you've got a new millennial age buyer who doesn't want to talk to a human. So they're actively going after digital moments. When you start multiplying all these things together, you get into the trillions of permutations. But in the end, nothing's linear anymore. So allowing agents to get a little bit out of control and start to measure these moments and bring them back into a system that may not be human-led, that can help guide that customer to a successful outcome. And then if that successful outcome is using your product and using those partners, that's even a bonus. But orchestrating all these moments at this time relies on AI, because no level of spreadsheet or no software we have today in the channel space, can handle this level of combinations.
Mark, this is a moment where I'm really cautious here. Let's debunk. What are your thoughts on agentic AI? Seeing a lot of skepticism on LinkedIn wilderness.
So if we kind of view any technology, right, as it evolves, as it's in this state, it's now in this state, it keeps improving, hopefully, right, all this kind of stuff, right? Right now, agentic is, for a variety of reasons, little more than automation, okay, which is not a terrible thing, okay, but relative to the way it's being sold and the way that people's expectations are being cultivated, we're kind of back in the jungle again, right? I mean, technology has been doing this, as an industry has been doing this for, well, as long as I've been in it, right? And so I think there's going to be a lot of disappointed people in the immediate short term, right? This is kind of why we have this trough of disillusionment, and this slow crawl back up to the other side, right? We kind of do it to ourselves to some degree. I think that number one, nobody is really focusing on the importance of data quality to this whole thing, right? I mean, if McKinsey's right, and my own experience suggests that they're probably pretty close, that only about 3 to 5% of corporate data can support, like enterprise type AI, scaled AI, maybe a better way of putting it, then I mean that's a problem. I mean that's a really, that's where the issue isn't the gun, okay, the cannon. It's your supply chain of cannonballs that's the problem. So you've got that. Then, after 3 or 4 decades of trying really hard to make technology deterministic, I think everybody's starting to realize that that's just not the way, life is rejecting that, because the reality of life is highly probabilistic. So I think that in order to have agents that can make the right decisions more and more and more independently of us, which is kind of the whole idea, right? They need to have agency. And so they have to be able to maneuver. They have to be able to understand changing externalities and what they need, how they need to react and all this kind of stuff. And they better damn well have good data that to operate from in multiple levels, right? And so I would just say that that's where things are going to get really interesting. And then the other, there's always the big externality that really comes in kind of like a meteor and just goes boom, right? And in this case, on a very broad basis, that's the Delaware revisions of fiduciary duty, right? I mean, you're going to have to get your act together on your data, or you're going to be sued into oblivion by shareholders that are so pissed off because you can't support exactly this kind of AI that we're discussing.
Jay, what are you seeing in the data and the ecosystem land?
Yeah, maybe put a little bit of history and a little bit of future to what Mark just said. I mean, I lived through as an analyst, the RPA phase when we took companies like UiPath and Blue Prism and Automation Anywhere, and we created a $60 billion IPO around UiPath. This was the future of workflows and business processes and logic all coming together in kind of a drag and drop, codeless world that was going to drive us forward. It stopped kind of around what Mark said is the quality of data. I remind people today that 83% of the world's business data and the promise of AI over the course of this 20-year era that we're stepping into relies on that data that hasn't been trained and tuned, indexed, inferred, cleansed for AI yet. We're coming out of consumer poetry, music, and deepfakes into more role-based agentic AI, which is better emails, faster, better sales processes, invoicing, billing, service tickets. Everybody's personal role gets improved by 10 or 20%. But the, promise of AI, which is, in the true my co-pilot talks to your co-pilot world, that hasn't even started yet. We're measuring the global system integrators. We're measuring the Fortune 500. Every flight you've ever taken sits on a Sabre system that was put in place in the 1970s. Every banking transaction you've ever made sits on an IBM mainframe put in place in the 1970s. Every social security request with the government. Basically, most of our lives revolve around very old, unstructured, unusable data to this. But we get about 10 years to figure that out. Agentic AI in the next 3 to 5 years, and then more physical AI after that, then leads us into kind of this larger frame. But understanding decades that go by are important, and understand that this isn't a bomb that goes off, but actually a set rollout of how this is going to interact. But things do change very quickly, and things do look very different. Bill Gates said in 1996 that we overestimate the first 2 years of any new technology, and we underestimate the first 10. And I believe agentic AI is going to fit that model perfectly.
I would just add this little story because I agree with what you're saying. Right. So, among other things, I've found myself as an expert witness in several cases regarding data quality. There was a shareholder lawsuit against a company in California, pretty big, not super big, but pretty big, around CRM data quality. Which, if you've been in this business, as everybody on this call has, for any length of time, you know that it's a meme, okay, of just how bad it can get. And so they got permission from the judge to put um, fraud detection software onto the CRM. And there was roughly 14 years worth of sales data in that CRM. And two-thirds of it, a little more than two-thirds of it, came back as engineered. Okay, which of course is no great shock, okay, to probably anybody. But it actually goes to the heart of this data quality issue, and that is while there are kind of external reasons why data can be messed up, screwed up, broken, whatever, right? The vast majority of the problem is that everybody is, for their own reasons, on a very hyper local basis, are cooking their own books, right? Because they're trying to protect their job, they're trying to do this, they're trying to do that, right? And then it all aggregates and accumulates over time, and then we have this kind of situation. So it's going to be, this is going to be a far bigger limiting effect on technology, period, going forward. Okay. Certainly agentic, than a lot of people want to acknowledge. And, it's just one of those things where it is what it is.
One of the community questions that we're receiving here is actually to the point of data and cross-functional aspects of it, Jay, that I believe you shared in your post. So the question is, when GTM teams each spin up agents, how do you avoid chaos and overlap?
Yeah, I mean, it's the strategy, I just saw yesterday's MarTech stack up to 15,367 ISVs. The sales tech stack, over 5,000. I run my own channel tech stack above here, but add the CX tech stack and the product stack on top of that. There are 250,000 ISVs on the way to 1 million, this decade. Now that AI is building software, we don't even have to go and hire developers as part of building our SaaS company. The fact of the matter is, the 7-layer stack of how we solve our own jobs and how we've kind of set up the processes of, moving data change pretty considerably when there's no logging. When each of these CRUD databases actually become headless, and we're starting to introduce them to agents and then create these paths that aren't linear, but agents that can bounce across data sets when they need them. So I'll use an example. Salesforce does a really big sales study every year, and they talk to 5,500 CROs. In the most recent study, 89% of salespeople in the world use partners every day. So for the 11% that aren't, like 58% plan to within a year. It kind of gets to the 96% of the entire $5.4 trillion tech industry that has partners surrounding the customer. In a sales process that kind of avoided that for a long time, now there's a need, agentic, and in Salesforce's world, it'll be Agentforce. In Microsoft's world, it'll be a Copilot, but there's a need before you think about your account-based marketing plan, before you think about the 28 moments the customer's going to go through before making a decision, you have to go tap into 100 more databases to understand the moments that are actually partner-led moments, not product-led, not sales-led or marketing-led moments. So to be successful in the future, you have to do that better than your competitor, better than the salesperson working for your competitor is doing. And then in the end, we know that it can't be a person doing it. The systems have to be built to be automated to handle that next best action with the customer without humans. So it's not only headless, it's humanless. And so you ask about chaos. What data do I introduce? What outcomes do I allow? And how do I constantly measure and readjust, how that's working at the end customer? Because there's really only one thing that takes away chaos is customer obsession. The only moments that matter are your customers' moments. And for all the movement around agentic AI, it's going to come down to how those moments move from one to the next. And whether it's adding friction to your processes, marketing, sales, CX processes, or helping.
So this is actually where maybe we have a slightly different point of view, which is probably why everybody wants to hear this. It's I think it's going to be the buyer's use of agents that are going to be far more life altering, right? Than anything that marketers or salespeople on the vendor side ever choose to do. There's a huge shift in the balance of power that goes beyond kind of like the final decision that it's always been the buyers, right? Into how they want to be dealt with. And I'm already seeing a lot of buyer bots that are doing phenomenal things, right? They're going out with only a problem statement and they're sweeping through the marketplace. They're collecting all kinds of information. They're stratifying the options. They are personalizing all of the vendor content internally from the buyer perspective, right? Basically, it's almost like they're doing what Forrester has been talking about as a quasi-reality for the last 20 years. That's actually happening today, right? I think it's one of the reasons why we're probably looking at 80 to 90% attrition on sales roles over the next 3 or 4 years. I think it's why the state of marketing in B2B is going to be significantly different because there's going to be whole parts of what have been kind of like a part of the norm, right? Whether you think of it as a stack or as an organization that are just going to vaporize, right? And so I think that one of the things about a super technology, and AI is definitely falls in that category, and agents are an expression of that. What defines a super technology is it plays both sides of the field, right? There's almost like mutual assured destruction at the end of the day. And so, Julia, my take on how you deal with, how you govern chaos, right, is that number one side is ultimately calling the tune, and that's a form of governance right there. So if I reject marketing automation emails at my server level and just say not doing it anymore, the odds are over some period of time that marketers are going to stop doing that, right? Because it's no longer effective. I think that also you're looking at a point at which you ironically get back to humanity, okay? If everybody does what everybody has always done, and that is use AI, use agents to just, scale into the ether, right? Stuff that they don't know works. And so this is where having the causal reference, the causal brain on all this is going to be so indispensable.
Yeah, I spent a lot of my career at Forrester, sitting beside the person that authored The Death of the Salesman, authored the speed of
Yeah.
the, if I
Yeah.
had to harken back 20 years at one of these major technological events that you mentioned, is when Google, became 81% of the start of every customer journey. Whether you're buying a car, any considered purchase, whether you're buying $1 million worth of software, 81% of buyers relied on a Google search. So, what happened? The ether, what you talk about, and all the things. No, and whole industries were created. The 15,000 Martech and AdTech tools I mentioned, half of them were engineered on how to get to the first 10 listings on the front page of Google.
Sure.
Entire careers were formed, entire university courses and degrees were created. And now the world just doesn't, the buyer, I totally agree with you, by the way, on the buyer agent side. 75% of the new majority buyer as of January this year, demographics say the majority buyer is now born after 1982. So we do have a millennial-led buyer. 75% of them don't want to talk to a human. So they're going to build these better and better buyer bots and buyer agents that work on their behalf that are so much better than a Google search. I don't want 10 listings that I have to go listen to podcasts and read ebooks. I mean, you go do that for me and you
Right.
accelerate a lot of these 28 moments. But in its how it's consumed, and you talked about stratifying, you talked about reading the internet cover to cover. I worked at IBM when we played Jeopardy, played Ken Jennings, and we only had milliseconds to read the internet cover to cover before we had to answer, Alex Trebek in the form of a question. This AI and how it's formed and how it's built, there's going to be a counter force of how it consumes information and then how it lists, the different things. So, jobs that we don't know exist yet, careers and university degrees that don't exist yet, are on the counterforce of these buyer agents and how companies are going to, over the next 3, 5, and 10 years, going to respond to how these agents.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I just think that like one of the things that is so important today for today's buyer, right, is the issue of risk,
Mhm.
right? None of the stuff, Google, et cetera, right, gave you any insight into relative risk, right? And that is actually where the interaction of AI agents and other things, right, that some of which have not even come yet. That's where that's going to be so important. And it's where also I'm taking this perspective because I operate in an area of causal AI, right? And so this is kind of like from a vendor perspective, everything you're trying to accomplish against to achieve this particular outcome, net of all this stuff in the middle that you don't control, one of which is the buyer obsession with risk, right? How do you deal with that? It's expressed today in longer and longer buying journeys, number of deals closed with no decision. I mean, it's endless, right? And so I think that this is where the companies that I'm aware of that are using buyer bots, for example, are saying, evaluate what all these vendors are saying out there about themselves and put it on a factual index, right? Tell us who we can really at least trust the quality of their information. And are they saying things that actually are executable, are real, are in production, right? Things like that. And so I think that's just in the short term, that's where it's really, really going. The problem is that all the stuff that Salesforce is doing, I'm not picking on Salesforce,
Yep.
isn't about that. It's about glorified errand boys.
Yeah, you've gone back to risk a couple of times, but in parallel to all of this, over the course of the next decade, today you've got a $282 billion cybersecurity industry. And inside of that, you have a 28% growth rate on compliance. So, companies looking at regulatory governance. This is before, by the way, your airlines, your governments, your banks have decided to move any of that on-premises data into any of these models.
No, it's
So
true.
you can understand that compounded growth around risk is going to grow at the same, parallel pace that agentic AI grows over this time. So anyone that's looking at these models is understanding they need a check mark in certain places.
The only caveat that I would put on that is that right now, Agentic is exclusively a correlation-based, machine learning-based thing, right? So when we're talking about the difference between a correlative answer and a causal inference answer, we're talking about anywhere from 4,000 to 7,000 basis points, right, of spread. So we're going to rapidly get to a point where a new brain is going to be necessary for the agents. I mean, it's unavoidable.
Yeah. Well, the last word I think on this topic is, there is no avoidance of risk. There is a protection of risk, though, which is what is reasonable. And, if I just go back to cyber for a second, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And so AI is going to be the same thing. It's going to be a question of when your personal customer data or financial data shows up on ChatGPT for the general audience to see it. It's a question of when. Did you take precautions? Did you check all the boxes that a reasonable person would check? And that's what the judge would, judge based on that. And then if you did, with all the smartest people in the world, that allows you to move on from risk and aggressively, go down this path. Julia?
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure. Our community is loving it, seeing a lot of comments and conversations, but we are at the top of the hour. And before we transition to our next session, Mark and Jay, what would be your recommendation to people who's actually considering, like, what's the next step in terms of agentic ecosystems, headless ecosystems? Where do we start? How do we transition?
Get your data straight, right? I mean, otherwise you're starting from a chaos position.
Yeah. For me, it's just get obsessed about your own job role. Obviously, get obsessed about your customer and the part of that you serve. And for your own career perspective, you need to go in deeper than 99% of other people in similar parts of their career than you are.
Thank you so much again.